I have to say, and I don't usually begin my videos, my lecture videos this way, that this is a work that I feel more of a sense of trepidation approaching and talking about and providing a lecture upon for something like about an hour, more than I feel towards most of the other works that I talk about. And it's not because I feel like Rilke is foreign to me. It's rather the opposite, that I find the things that he has to say so resonate with me personally that I'm almost tempted just to read the letters to you verbatim, but I don't think that would make for much of a lecture video where I'm supposed to be explicating what's going on in the text and connecting up things and explaining. So, you know, this is something a little unusual. I've put off for several days talking about this text. I've just been reading it and reading it and reading it over and over again and mulling over certain passages. You notice I've got the blackboard all ready to begin the lecture, and I will in just a moment. But I wanted to say something about that, in part because it does actually fit very well with some of the themes that Rilke talks about and that I'm going to share with you momentarily. I think that Rilke, at least for me, is one of the greatest poets to write in any language. And I find there's a certain kind of easiness and freedom and matter-of-factness in getting towards very deep, fundamental, and yet intensely personal matters that runs throughout his work, that makes them so fruitful, so useful for me, and perhaps that'll be the case for you. So now is a good point to actually, like, you know, put all that stuff aside and begin the lecture in earnest. So, Rainer Maria Rilke's Letters to a Young Poet is one of the classic pieces of existentialist literature. I think that if you encounter Rilke and you only are going to read a few of his works, this is definitely one of them that is well worth digging into, because he's dealing with some very fundamental themes that are taken up not only by Rilke in his other work, but by all these other existentialist thinkers. And he's got his own peculiar, but also very rich take upon them. So I wanted to signal at the beginning some of the key themes that these letters, there are 10 letters, are concerned with. One thing that you see running throughout the entire work, and I'll be talking about this a little bit more in detail shortly and talking about some of the passages, is this notion of solitude. He brings this up over and over and over again with the interlocutor in these letters. Tied together with that is this notion of silence. I think you should also add to this not only growth, but also individuality, patience, time. All those things fit in with what Rilke is calling solitude. Also distance, but we'll explore those themes in a few minutes. Another thing that he talks about that runs throughout all of these letters is this sense that not only poetry, not only art in general, but a person's way of living, the things that they actually find important, if they're living a authentic, a genuine life, they're coming out of some sort of necessity, some need on their part, what he also calls in other parts fate. And he talks about this as not being something that just comes from the outside to a person and is imposed on them, but as something that grows from within, the inner. There's an inner necessity, an inner development that takes place, and we'll get to that in a moment. Developing as a person, as an artist. This is really central, running throughout these letters. The young interlocutor is writing Rilke in part looking for the kind of advice about this, and Rilke has plenty of it to impart. A lot of it is the fruit of his own painful, sorrowful, suffering development, which takes place over time. And Rilke tends to look at real development of a person as being something akin to natural processes that take place within something like a plant. If you think about, he's got this metaphor of the tree that doesn't have to think about whether its sap is going to rise in the spring, that happens within it. And if you allow these processes of development to take place, if you clear away the clutter and keep yourself from committing yourself to the wrong sorts of things that will block your development, it will naturally take place. It can't be forced. It can't be gamed. It can't be sped up. And there's also this sense that you have certain things, within you. This ties in with the fate notion, and you may, in fact, be called to be an artist, or you may not be called to be an artist, but only by descending into the depths of your own being will you find that out. Another thing that comes up over and over again, if we're talking about authentic, proper development, the person coming into their own, the artist actually realizing what it is that they are called to, there's many ways to go wrong as well, and some of these have to do with sort of living a conventional life, and even some of the ways of going against convention, Rilke says, are quite conventional. There is a lot of ways, a lot of choices, a lot of paths that we can take that take us away from what it is that we're meant to be, what it is that life has put before us as our possibility. It is possible to have a destiny and yet to miss one's destiny for Rilke. And he thinks that this is what happens to the majority of people in his own time. I think he would say the same thing about our time, and yet he envisages a future in which this would not be necessarily the case, something that we in fact ourselves can contribute to and participate in. In fact, I should put that down as one of the other central themes, and I'll put it down as time. Rilke is interested in what the future really is, what the future really holds, what the present moment includes, what its possibilities are, how we ought to approach it, and what do we make of our past. He has quite a bit of advice for this young man about his past, particularly his childhood. So we'll come back to that issue of time. There's a few other things that I want to signal as well. He's got some very interesting discussions about sexuality, about sex itself, the carnal act, and what goes right in it and what goes wrong in it, and how sex is in many respects a problem rather than a source of enjoyment for us. And he has a lot of just brilliant discussions about love connected in with this as well. So we want to hit on those. There's this term that comes up over and over again, capitalized things. And this is something that's really central to Rilke's thought. Nature includes things, our surroundings. For instance, this chalkboard could be a thing in that sense. Love and life and death are things. He talks about serious things. He talks about things that have lost their meaning. And in German, of course, they're always capitalized because nouns are capitalized, so it's, Dinge. But why do we capitalize it in our English translations? Because for Rilke, thingliness is, in some way, you could say it's a mode in which the world and life communicates with us. Our keepsakes, the things that matter to us, particularly in childhood, they're not necessarily just articles say, of clothing or toys or matters like that. They could also be architectural. It could be a certain, well, for me, having grown up in Wisconsin, a certain arrangement of honeysuckle that we used to hide under and make a fort out of. Those can be what he calls things. So we're going to explore what that means and why that's important to him in this. And then finally, there are some places in here where Rilke talks about God. And he talks about God in some very extraordinary ways that might be quite shocking to some. And a lot of people view Rilke as being completely unorthodox, as being essentially a pantheist, reducing God to nature. I don't actually see it that way, but I'm going to try to keep my own views out of this as much as possible and just present Rilke in his own words and for his own sake. Now, before we begin going through these themes, I'm not going to be reading these letters sequentially and just going from one to the next to the next. I will be doing them semi-sequentially in that I'm going to be focusing on particular themes that are coming up in particular letters and connecting those together. We want to think a little bit about the genre and a little bit about the situation of these letters. I think that this is particularly important given that Rilke is primarily a poet. He is somebody who writes in a way that is experimental and in many respects radically new. He is doing things with poetry that other people previous to him were perhaps only hinting at. He changes his style, and he changes not just his style, but also his very way of conceiving what his poetic project is from period to period to period. And he's using poetry as a vehicle for doing what it is that philosophers do when philosophers are actually living up to their job, what it is that philosophy is supposed to be about, which is grappling with reality, trying to actually approach it and understand it, and perhaps even love it. Which means not only reality outside of ourselves, the traditional problem of what is the world, but also other people, and delving into our own selves, and ultimately leading to questions about the divine. All of those fall within the province of philosophy, and oftentimes philosophers are very careless or cavalier or all too brutal or have a tin ear or lack discrimination in how they deal with these sorts of things. Rilke is trying to do this with poetry, the medium of language. Now this is not actually poetry. These are, of course, letters, and they're letters to another guy who wants to be a poet, who has written poetry. Now there's lots of people who would like to be poets out there, and quite frankly, many of them are not particularly good, and Rilke would say they're not actually called to be poets. There's only so many people who actually have that as their fate or their destiny. And this guy is in the process of trying to figure out, should I actually be a poet? At the same time, he's also being drawn into the military profession. He's going to be an officer. And the question is, can this sort of lifestyle admit of, be compatible with, perhaps even complement this poetic activity that he's involved in? And the very beginning of the letters, what we find out is that this guy has sent Rilke some of his poetry. And Rilke says, "I want to thank you for the great confidence you've placed in me, That's all I can do. I cannot discuss your verses. For any attempt at criticism would be foreign to me. And he goes so far as to tell the young man, right now you don't have style. You don't have a style of your own. I've read through your work, and I don't know, there might be something there, but at this point it's nascent, it's potential. It is not something fully realized, that I'm not going to try to BS you, young man, and tell you that things are other than they are. As a matter of fact, what I think you ought to do is do some real soul searching. Enter into yourself. I'll read you this passage, because he says, "Go into yourself, find out the reason that commands you to write, see whether it has spread its roots into the very depths of your heart. Confess to yourself whether you would have to die if you were forbidden to write. Would you sacrifice in order to be able to write, which is not just to communicate to other people. The poet is a shaper of language. The poet, the genuine poet, is somebody who is carving out, like a sculptor carves out the marble, or forming the way that a potter forms the clay, or weaving together the way that a weaver brings together the warp and the weft, and brings patterns and colors into these complexes. A poet is doing that with language. So a poet has to have a very intimate connection with the language with which he or she is actually working. They have to have not only a intimate connection of experience and knowledge, but of affectivity, of love. They have to be armed with a certain kind of stock of images and words and melodies that they have labored over and been bothered by and not been able to escape for some time. Rilke is asking this guy, is that the case for you? If it isn't, no harm, no foul. You don't have to be a poet. You can live a perfectly fine life whether you're a poet or not. And Rilke actually ends that first letter by saying, after this descent into yourself, into your solitude, perhaps you will have to renounce being a poet. Nevertheless, even then, this self-searching that I ask of you will not have been for nothing. What he's saying here, I think this is something very important to carry forth about this. We're not all called to be poets. I know I'm not a poet. Why is this work valuable for us then? Because the kind of soul-searching, the kind of examination of the self in terms of the ideas and concepts and experiences that Rilke is throwing in front of this guy help us to understand our own lives, our own predicaments, our own histories up until this point, and figure out what we're doing. It's not just a sort of litmus test for, do you have the chops to be a poet? It's rather about, look, the poet is a certain mode of life. But life is something that calls to be lived genuinely, fully. So he tells this young man, your life will still find its own paths from there, and that they may be good, rich, and wide is what I wish for you more than I can say. It's a beautiful thing to say to another person, that the paths of your life may be good and rich and wide. That your life will be full. Doesn't mean that it's going to be happy all the time or full of pleasure. As a matter of fact, solitude, loneliness, sorrow, these are all components in a full life, according to Rilke. But that's a rich life. So, what we're looking at in this is essentially Rilke's own reflections given to this young man through the form of letters, 10 letters to be exact, running over a period of roughly 5 years. The first letter is from February 17th, 1903, and the last letter is from the day after Christmas, 1908. So actually we're talking about a little bit, 5.5 years. These are things that took Rilke time to work out, to meditate, to ferret out from his own depths and then to give to this other guy. So we want, above all, to be patient in reading through these letters. It's very easy to skim them. I think that would be a bad practice. These are letters that call to be read and reread over and over again, much like a Platonic dialogue or an Aristotelian text, or a great work by Kierkegaard or by Nietzsche, or a play like any of those by Euripides or Shakespeare or any other, Eugene O'Neill, any great playwright. George Bernard Shaw I particularly like as well. So that's the genre. That's some of the key themes of this work. Now let's actually start exploring some of these themes one by one, and gradually I think a complex picture will emerge for you. If I had to select one theme that I would say is the most central, pervasive element of this work, it would be this notion of solitude and being solitary, and what that involves for Rilke and why it's so centrally important. You might think that this is a work born out of loneliness, out of longing for others, but Rilke actually sees solitude as something quite positive, and he thinks that it's important not only for the artistic life and for the development of the person as an artist. He thinks that it's centrally important for everybody. And we'll get to that when we get to letter 8 a little bit, in a little bit more metaphysical detail. He starts out, and you notice I've got a list of the different themes. And there's more than this going on, by the way, but these are just sort of rubrics under which I've placed these notions of solitude in the different letters. In the first letter, it's sort of, they're getting to know each other, and he's giving advice to this young man, and he tells him, if you're going to write, don't write the sorts of things that people want you to do. Don't write love poems, for example. Why? Because they're, in a certain respect, too easy, and that makes them too hard. Don't write things that require you to do the sorts of things that other people have been doing. You know why? Because only the masters, only the totally mature artists can do those well. So instead, what should you do? Well, they say, write what you know. Rilke is telling this young man that. He says, rescue yourself from these general themes and write about what your everyday life offers you. Describe your sorrows and desires, the thoughts that pass through your mind, and your belief in some kind of beauty. If your everyday life seems poor, don't blame it. Blame yourself. Admit to yourself you're not enough of a poet to call forth its riches. Because for the Creator there is no poverty and no poor indifferent place. When we tell ourselves things like, I'm bored, or this is no good, that's, in Rilke's view, a sign that there's something missing in us. There's something damaged or lacking to ourselves. And he says, even if you found yourself in some kind of prison whose walls let in none of the world's sound, wouldn't you still have your childhood, that jewel beyond all price? That's a very interesting thing to talk about, that jewel beyond all price. And Rilke will talk about childhood as being, in its own way, a kind of solitary time. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in some of the later letters. He says, try to raise up the sunken feelings of this enormous past. Your personality will grow stronger. Your solitude will expand. It just won't deepen. It will also expand. It will expand and become a place where where you can live in the twilight, where the noise of other people passes by. To be solitary does not mean to withdraw to the mountaintop, to the cabin in the dark forest where nobody else is around. You can do it even within a city. It's a kind of state of being. So he says, and if out of this turning within, out of this immersion in your own world, this is not navel gazing. This is actually like being attentive to what one's past and one's memories contain. if out of this poems come, then you will not think of asking anyone whether they're good or not. They will be something that comes out of you. So this is an important set of reflections about solitude. He's bringing up the theme there. And it's a bit later where he's going to talk about the relationship, or elaborate the relationship between solitude and inner life and patience. And this comes up in a context where he's telling the young man, don't pay any attention to literary criticism. That's not going to be useful. He says, always trust yourself and your own feeling as opposed to argumentation, discussions, or introductions of that sort. If it turns out that you're wrong, the natural growth of your inner life will eventually guide you to other insights. Allow your judgments their own silent, undisturbed development. I want to stop on that for a moment and just think about this. Allow your judgments, which we often talk in terms of making hasty judgments. Judgments are not something that you should deploy and develop because you've got everything all figured out in life. Rather, they're things that you actually have to mull over, that you may be wrong about, that you have to put together bit by bit by bit when it comes to important things. So he says, like all progress, they will come deep from within and cannot be forced or hastened. Solitude gives us this space in which we can exercise the patience that we need to develop a true inner life, to develop real, authentic selfhood, Rilke would say. He says, to let each impression and each embryo of a feeling come to completion entirely in itself, in the dark, in the unsayable, the unconscious, beyond the reach of one's understanding, and with deep humility and patience to wait for the hour when a new clarity is born. There are so many times when we feel that we have to have the answers to things. And we live, just as much as in Rilke's time, in a society where not only are we demanded to have answers for things, but it's presented as if you don't have the answers to things, somehow your life is screwed up. And you just, aren't somebody to listen to. You don't matter. Rilke is saying, no, answers take a long, long time to come if they're real answers, not just flip, cardboard, useless things. And you have to allow them to have their processes of development. You need solitude. You need a kind of being in yourself and not taking in all the other voices, not going on Facebook and what people have to see, what people have to say about it, not looking at the comment section, but actually allowing things to work upon you in order to do that. So, let's skip on a little bit more. Oops. In letter 4, he tells the young man to love his solitude. That is a very important insight. He says, now here we get to this sense of the future as well. Everything that may someday be possible for many people, the solitary man can now already prepare and build with his own hands, which make fewer mistakes. Rilke understands that in the kind of society that we live in, both in his own time, around the turn of the last century, and in this new millennium, we are living within a society in which most people are not actually cognizant of what solitude would be and why it's important. And we're not cultivating it. Instead, we're cultivating a lot of busyness and noise and sociability and paying attention to what's external. Rilke is saying, love your solitude. Love it. Why? Those who are near you are far away, you write, and this shows that the space around you is already beginning to grow vast. Solitude is conceived of by Rilke not only in terms of interiority, but also in terms of distance. And you can be right next to somebody and yet be worlds away from them. And that can be a good thing or that can be a bad thing. When it's your lover and you've had a fight, I think many of us know what that feels like when there's, differences that have arisen over even what the difference is. You feel like there's this almost like a briar patch in between you and them that that can't be crossed, or as if a concrete wall has been placed between you that can't be broken. On the other hand, the solitude of being alone with one's own thoughts and being able to think them, there's a kind of freedom, there's a kind of joy involved in that Rilke thinks that we need to focus on and experience and cultivate, and even when it's possible, share. So he says, if what is near you is far away, then your vastness is already among the stars and is very great. Be happy about your growth. Solitude is required in order for us to have growth, in order not to be hemmed in order for us to relate the cosmos to ourselves. And he's not saying some sort of, purely solipsistic or narcissistic kind of attitude towards things, because that's not actually attentive to things. That turns everything into how it relates to me. And the narcissist, by the way, is always interested in what other people are thinking. They just want everybody to think greatly of themselves. They paste onto them a projection of their desires. He says, be happy about your growth, in which, of course, you can't take anyone with you. Be gentle with those who stay behind. Be confident and calm in front of them. Don't torment them with your doubts, and don't frighten them with your faith or joy, which they wouldn't be able to comprehend. Seek out some simple and true feeling of what you have in common with them. Solitude doesn't cut us off from other people. Solitude actually makes us more able to relate ourselves in genuine ways, in productive, healthy ways with other people. You may not be able to bring other people along into it, or give them, have them, develop a taste for the fruits of solitude. But you can cultivate it within yourself. So, let's go on a little bit further. Number 6, letter 6, we start getting to something a bit more metaphysical, you could say. He says, there is only one solitude. He says, and he's writing at Christmas to this guy. He says, when you in the midst of the holiday are bearing your solitude more heavily than usual, when you notice it is vast, you should be happy. For what, you should ask yourself, would be a solitude that is not vast? A solitude that is not vast is kind of a fake solitude, a safe solitude. He says, there is only one solitude, and it is vast, heavy, difficult to bear, and almost everyone has hours when he would gladly exchange it for any kind of sociability, however trivial or cheap. So what is Rilke saying here about solitude? He's saying this is part of the human condition per se. This is part of the essence of human beings. We are social creatures, but we are not just social creatures. We also have this portion of solitude, of selfness, of being on our own and not being able to put everything, and really we shouldn't put everything in terms of what is socially shared. And he says, these are the hours when you can practice something. These are the hours when solitude grows. And it's growing as painful as the growing of boys. If you've ever experienced growing pains, I know I had them when I was a kid, and I remember my daughter having them because she grew quite tall quite quickly. And it's painful, but that's part of the process of growth, everything adjusting. So he says, the growing is painful and sad as the beginning of spring, but that must not confuse you. What is necessary, after all, is only this: solitude, vast inner solitude, to walk inside of yourself and meet no one for hours. That is what you must be able to attain, to be as solitary as you were when you were a child. Now, you might say, well, this is just a reflection of Rilke. He was an only child, and he had this weird kind of childhood. And, when he went away to military school, he didn't make a lot of friends. And maybe there's something of that in there. But I don't think we should reduce this to biography. I think that what Rilke is talking about is, remember how you could lose yourself if you were allowed to in the woods. When I was a kid, we would be sent outside. We were the first latchkey generation, but we were also on our own quite a bit, not in the house but outside. And our parents would say, "All right, don't want to see you until dinner time. And we would find things to do. And if you were on your own, maybe you'd go and try to find another kid. But then, you might play games and realize you're not even playing the same game with that kid. That's solitariness. But oftentimes you could play by yourself. Play in the sandbox, make a castle, have army men fight each other, swing on a rope by the trees, explore trails, find new patches of flowers or interesting looking plants, and smell them and taste them and see what they're like. Ride your bikes around the different county roads and subdivisions and cul-de-sacs and see where they go. That's part of what he's talking about. Of course, I'm writing in a very different time and place, but so you see. And he says, when you were a child, the grown-ups walked around involved with matters that seemed large and important because they looked so busy and you didn't understand a thing about what they were doing. I remember, for example, my dad, doing the bills. He was a tax attorney, so he had this adding machine, and he'd be doing the bills and furrowed brow and all that. And I had no idea what he was doing, just make sure, not to interrupt him while he was actually thinking about something. And that was important because it kept our household together, and he was probably actually doing work on weekends, now that I think about it. But I didn't have to concern myself with that. We'd get driven around to different places. We didn't have to think about that. That was part of childhood. There's a letting go in solitude, a not having to be concerned with every single thing, with not being anxious that's involved there. So he talks about the vastness of your own solitude, which is itself work and status and vocation. Why would you want to give up a child's wise not understanding in exchange for defensiveness and scorn? Since not understanding is, after all, a way of being alone. So he's talking here about how this young man can live out his profession and have solitude. In letter 8, he goes even further, and he says something really brilliant. He says, to speak of solitude again, it becomes clearer and clearer that fundamentally this is nothing that one can choose or refrain from. I want to say that again. This is nothing that one can choose or refrain from. On some basic level, Rilke says, we are solitary. That is part of what it means to be a human being. That is of the essence of human being. It says we can delude ourselves about this and act as if it were not true. That's all. But how much better it is to recognize that we are alone. Yes, even to begin from this realization. And then he talks about a kind of vertigo that comes with that. I remember, and this is very personal and perhaps you can't relate to it, but I remember when I was a kid, in certain contexts, of course I could lose myself in many other contexts, but when I was out in society, I was very nervous in part because I felt like people might always be watching me. And I would do and say stupid things in part to sort of like cover up what I felt at the time to be, shameful or not cool reasons for doing something. So like, here's an example. If I came into a room and was really interested in something that I thought others might make fun of me for, I would, look at it, but also try to sort of convey by my attitude that I was only looking at it so that I could criticize it or put it down. And now, why did I do something so stupid as that? Why did I waste my time and thought and energy on that? Because I felt like I felt like I wasn't solitary at that point. Like I was, in some ways, transparent to everybody else. And it was so liberating to realize just how little attention most people paid to most things that are going on, including the motives and the actions of other people, I found that to be, a great weight lifted off my shoulder, and it helped me to enjoy something like what he's calling solitariness here. But it can also produce a kind of sense of vertigo. He says, there is no longer anything near us, and everything is infinitely far. And he talks about the courage that we need in order to face these things. But not everything does become infinitely far. Other persons, we might feel, become infinitely far. But this is where we come to the importance of things, with a capital T, that Rilke will talk about a little bit later. And he talks about the need for courage to be able to face this. He says, it's not only indolence that causes human relationships to be repeated from case to case with such unspeakable monotony and boredom. It's timidity. It's a lack of courage. So he says that solitude is something that we need for this. Finally, in the last letter, this is the day after Christmas, 1908. The young man has been in the military now for some time, and he says, this is what Rilke says to him, I have thought about you often during this holiday, and imagine how silent you must be in your solitary fort among the empty hills, upon which those large southern winds fling themselves as if they wanted to devour them in large pieces. It must be immense, this silence, in which sounds and movements have room, and if one thinks that along with all this the presence of the distant sea also resounds, perhaps as the innermost note in this prehistoric harmony, then one can only wish that you are trustingly and patiently letting the magnificent solitude work upon you, this solitude which can no longer be erased from your life, which in everything that is in store for you to experience and do will act as an anonymous influence, continuously and gently decisive, rather as the blood of our ancestors incessantly moves in us and combines with our own to form the unique, unrepeatable being that we are at every turning of our life. One sentence, one very long, beautiful sentence. Nature can provide us with the kind of solitude that we're thinking about. And I think a lot of people are, unfortunately, because of the society that we live in, quite cut off from the capacities of nature. But it only takes, learning how to reattend to it. It's possible as well in many other contexts. You could think of, the quiet of a library, where you're among all these tomes of books. It's possible to experience solitude even in one's work, when one pays attention to the work that one is accomplishing and doesn't allow all sorts of external things and other people's opinions and views and desires and their ratings of you and evaluations to assume a central role. Where, for example, in reading Rilke, is it important that this video get lots and lots of views, or is it sufficient if one person, only one person alone, actually is moved to read the Rilke and then, finds what he's talking about, this solitude, and says, aha, yeah, I need that. What is more important? What is more real? This is the sort of question that you can only really answer successfully if you possess a portion of that solitude. Rilke thinks that we all, sort of ontologically, are equipped to do it, but that we hide ourselves from it, and we cut ourselves off from it, and therefore don't allow the solitude to work upon us and to produce us as the sorts of things that we are intended to be. One of the great lessons I think this work can actually provide us with, if we're attentive to it, is how to think about our own development, not only up till this point, but further on. What do we make of it? How do we actually live a full, rich, authentic life? Whether we're thinking about it in terms of artistry or our profession or something else. And there's a very strong contrast running through here. I should put over here as well the individual. There's solitude, which requires patience, and then there's the realm of the conventional, the social, and where people make a lot of mistakes, even in their individual life. Mistakes that they think are going to get them to something more individual, something deeper, but really just carry them back into the superficiality of social life once again. And, the advice that he gave in the very first letter, avoid these forms that everybody else uses. Try to go back to your own childhood or your own present and pay attention to the things around you. That's something quite important. But I think there's other things that we want to see in here as well. In the second letter, he talks about irony. And, he means irony in the modern sense, of being kind of sardonic. And he says, don't let yourself be controlled of it, especially during uncreative moments. There's a great danger. I think this is some excellent advice, particularly for adolescents, particularly for smart adolescents, but also for many older and kind of bitter people. Irony takes us away from the depths of things. It's a response that doesn't always reveal. Sometimes it's more covering up. He says, if it's used purely, it too is pure and one need not be ashamed of it. So he's not saying irony is always bad. But he's saying that if you feel yourself becoming too familiar with it, then if you're afraid of this growing familiarity, then the remedy is to turn to great and serious objects. Read the Odyssey, for example, and don't just read it, and mock it because of its patriarchal themes, or, obviously this is just fiction or something like that. Read it the way that somebody who actually loves the stuff reads it. Or listen to music and don't think about how you can blog about it later. There's a lot of different ways of thinking about this. And so he talks about irony as one of these sort of problems. There's other things that come up as well. Literary criticism. Now this could apply not only to literary criticism, but I think to the kind of critical attitude, whether it's a performance review or a comment on a YouTube video, or anything that you like, a remark as you leave the movie theater. Here's what he says about literary criticism. Read as little of it as possible if you want to be a real writer, if you want to be a poet. And it's kind of counterintuitive advice, right? Because you would think, well, I should find out what the experts actually want to see, and then I can supply them with what it is that they need. Well, no, if you're subjecting yourself to other people's desires, you're not actually working out your own genuine desires, and your product is just not going to be as authentic. So he says, what's wrong with literary criticism? These things are either partisan opinions, which have become petrified and meaningless, hardened and empty of life, or else they're clever word games in which one view wins and tomorrow the opposite view. And he says, works of art are of an infinite solitude. That's a brilliant thing to say. Works of art are of an infinite solitude. No means of approach is so useless as criticism. Only love can touch and hold them and be fair to them. So, we should also place on this side over here genuine love. And we'll come to, the sort of wrong decisions that get made about love over here a little bit later on. Skipping ahead a little bit to talk about the process of development. And we're going to come and talk about things a little bit more. He says, I'm not that, I wasn't that happy in Paris. Why? Because in Paris, there's this excessive noise that makes things tremble. Here I'm surrounded by an enormous landscape, and I can think a little bit better. And he says, if you trust in nature, in what is simple in nature, in the small things that hardly anyone sees, and that can so suddenly become huge, immeasurable. If you have this love for what is humble, and try very simply as someone who serves to win the confidence of what seems poor. Notice what he says there. To win the confidence of what seems poor. It's not a passive taking in of the landscape or, trails or things like that. There's a back and forth kind of dialogue. That's part of what love involves. Over here, I think you could say this is sort of, the consumeristic kind of attitude towards things. It always measures in terms of everybody else. Think about landscaping, for example. There's a lot of people who actually take very high pride in their yards, or what the English call oftentimes gardens. In French, the parterre. And they invest love in it. They care about when the crocuses come up and where they've planted them. I know what that's like because I have many people like that in my family. And then there's people who are just like, yeah, just put in a bunch of crap there, and whatever is current, that's fine. Make sure the bushes are trimmed and tidy, and there's really just nothing there to relate to. So he says, now this is again part of the thing about the process of development. Have patience with everything unresolved in your heart, and try to love the questions themselves as if they were locked rooms or books written in a very foreign language. You're not going to be able to answer everything at every stage of your life. Important questions require time and reflection and allowing things to fall into place. Let's call this the realm of simple or superficial answers over here. You don't want to give simple or superficial answers to important questions, to the great questions. Sometimes they can't even be really put as questions, like somebody will say love, and they're not even sure what they're asking about. Are they asking what is love? Should I be in love? How should I be in love? Is love different from infatuation? Sometimes you just love, and you're not even sure how to frame the question, let alone where to go to answer it. Yet there's all sorts of superficial answers that you have access to. You can go on and Google types of love, and there'll be like a whole chart. There'll be a whole bunch of different charts, and they won't all match up with each other. Pick whatever you like, and maybe it'll help you out, but probably not. He says, don't search for the answers which could not be given to you now, because you would not be able to live them. The answers to the really important questions are ones that cannot be provided immediately because we have to be ready to live them. When we talk about love, Rilke doesn't think that everybody is ready to love in the full sense. That's a very important topic that I'm putting off for the time being. Let's go on and talk about some of the other things that he brings up in terms of development. He talks about, I'm going to pass over that because that's about things. He talks about this need to pay attention to what is going on in your innermost self. This is in letter 6, he says. Think of the world that you carry inside you and call this thinking whenever you want to. A remembering of your own childhood or a yearning toward a future of your own. Only be attentive. Be attentive to what is arising within you and place that above everything you perceive around you. What is happening in your innermost self is worthy of your entire love. Somehow you must find a way to work at it and not lose too much time or too much courage in clarifying your attitude towards people. And he's bringing this up in terms of this guy's profession. How are you going to carry out a professional life and at the same time do this activity that is supposed to deepen you as a person and ready you to grow into being a poet. And then he says, I can only suggest, he says, I know your profession is hard and full of things that contradict you. I can only suggest that perhaps all professions are like that, filled with demands, filled with hostility towards the individual, saturated with, as it were, with the hatred of those who find themselves mute and sullen in an insipid beauty. So one of the dangers, and I'm going to put it over here, not to say that everybody who has a profession is necessarily in this, God forbid, because otherwise, as a philosopher, I'd be screwed, right? If it's all about insipid duties or stuff like that. But every profession has the danger of falling into that. Think about teaching, for example. Are you really engaged with your students, and is there back and forth? Are you doing the kind of things that aren't going to probably lead to good student evaluations and may not get you tenure or the full-time job or that sort of thing, but are really opening the possibility for learning and for communicating the passion and love that you have for what it is that you're teaching? Or are you sour? Have you become closed off? Are you treating your students as if they're just mere consumers filling up those seats and you don't even care about what it is that you're talking about anymore, or you're pushing something onto them, or you're just getting it done to get it done? That's the danger involved in any sort of professional life. And part of the danger comes about from the fact that anytime you're involved in a profession, you're not just on your own, you're in there with other people, some of whom have become sour and hard-hearted and closed off themselves. And they will, wear off on you. And you'll find yourself modeling yourself after them if you're not careful to preserve this other attitude instead. So, he suggests that if there's nothing that you can share with other people, try to be close to things. They will not abandon you. The nights are still there, the winds that move through the trees and across many lands. Everything in the world of things and animals is still filled with happening, which you can take part in. And children are still the way you were as a child, sad and happy in just the same way. And if you think of your childhood, you can once again live among them, among the solitary children. And the grown-ups are nothing, and their dignity has no value. Some very interesting advice that he has there. A little bit more about development in some of the other letters. I'm going to skip over this love discussion because I want to come back to that very soon. Here's something that I want to go to. He's talking about the future and our growth into it. And Rilke believes, at least what he says here, that time doesn't work the way that we ordinarily think about it. We think of the future as something that, is approaching us, or we're moving, along this timeline into the future. And we tend to view fate or destiny as something that comes to us from the outside, not actually something from the inside. Now, he starts out this discussion, this is in letter 8, by talking about sadness. And he says, the only sadnesses that are dangerous and unhealthy are the ones that we carry around in public in order to drown them out with the noise. Like diseases that are treated superficially and foolishly, they just withdraw and after a short interval break out the more terribly and gather inside us in our life that is unlived. This is a very important thing. Life that is unlived, rejected, lost, life that we can die of. Very poetic. In that it's paradoxical. It makes you think, what is it to have life that is not lived? What is it to have life that we can die of? Life can turn on itself. That's one of the strange aspects of life. It says, seems to me almost all of our sadnesses are moments of tension which we feel as paralysis because we no longer hear our astonished emotions living. We're alone with the unfamiliar presence that has entered us. Everything we trust and are used to is for a moment taken away from us. We stand in the midst of a transition where we cannot remain standing. That is why the sadness passes. The new presence inside us, the presence that has been added, has entered our heart, has gone into its innermost chamber, and is no longer there, is in our bloodstream. And we don't know what it was. He goes on and he likens this to the future. He says, the future enters us in this way in order to be transformed in us long before it happens. I need to say that one more time. The future enters into us to be transformed long before it happens. This is a different conception of time. It's one, again, where this quality of patience, of allowing things to occur within one's inner life that is growing is absolutely central. This sort of stuff cuts us off from that. And he goes on and he says, that's why it's so important to be solitary and attentive when one is sad, because the seemingly uneventful and motionless moment when our future steps into us is so much closer to life than that other loud and accidental point of time when it happens to us as from the outside. The quieter we are, the more patient and open we are in our sadnesses, the more deeply and serenely the new presence can enter us. And the more we can make it our own, and the more it becomes our fate. Later on, when it happens, we will feel related and close to it in our innermost being. People who are over here have a different kind of attitude towards the future. It grows in them. They allow it to grow in them. And then when it's there, they can say, oh, yeah, I recognize you. I'm ready for you. People over here are always like jumping from one thing to another. Their lives lack integration. And ironically, they jump from thing to thing to thing to try to give that integration to it. He says, fate does not come to us from the outside, but emerges from us. It's only because so many people have not absorbed and transformed their fates while they were living in them that they have not realized what was emerging from them. The future stands still, but we move in infinite space. He goes on a little bit further, and he says, he's talking about relationships. Only someone who is ready for everything, who doesn't exclude any experience, even the most incomprehensible, will live the relationship with another person as alive, and will himself sound the depths of his own being. For if we imagine the being of the individual as a larger or smaller room, it's obvious that most people come only to know one corner of the room, one spot near the window, one narrow strip on which they keep walking back and forth. In this way, they have a certain security. And he likens this to, he talks about the Poe and people learning their selves. And he says, we don't really have any reason for mistrusting the world, and we don't have any reason for really mistrusting ourselves. If we actually return within ourselves and cultivate this solitude, we will actually find, even though there are very dark parts and passages, that those are what we are, and we can come to terms with them. If we're always worried about thinking about how we would talk about it to another person, how we would communicate it, how we would make something of it, how we would explain it away, we'll never get at that. And this is not only something that blocks us in one moment from something, it's a question of habit, it's a question of time. You don't want to get towards the end of your life and have regrets that you never prepared yourself for solitude, because by then it's probably too late. There are a few other things where he talks about mistakes that people make. He talks about convention, and he says that oftentimes when we try to evade one convention, we do so by falling into another convention. That there's a lot of ways, and even the notion of solitude or self-development or self-realization, however you want to put it, could fall into this if we all became a Rilke society and got together on Thursday nights to do exercises about our solitude. Probably that would end up being something along these lines rather than something along these lines. This is most real, this development, this path of development, this process of development. But it can't be formalized, it can't be universalized. It requires that a person actually try to, work it out for themselves. There's some general lines that, if you're identifying yourself too closely with your profession and worrying about how everybody thinks about your profession, you're probably not going to, make it over here. But this is going to be very individuated, and it may not be easy to communicate between people. Rilke succeeded in doing so through his poetry. I'm willing to bet that these are 4 words, things, God, sex, and love, that you wouldn't ordinarily lump together unless you were writing some sort of strange sermon. But Rilke is talking about all of these in very important and interconnected ways in these letters to this young man. And why is he doing this? Well, in part because he's addressing a young man who is struggling with his profession and with his wish to be a poet, but also as a person. And these are all matters that come up within their discussion, within their worries, their concerns. And Rilke has a particularly, or you might say peculiarly worked out conception of things, you might say with a capital T. Things communicate with us. Their presence is, well, it's not personal. He's not personifying them. They're not merely inert matter. They have value, and not just a purely subjective value. They communicate something to us. They can teach us something. But we have to be adaptable enough to not expect everything to be like a person. And he uses things in a number of ways. He talks about things of nature. So we could think, for example, of a landscape or a boulder or a plant or a field. We could think of a road as being a thing in this sense. They can become familiar to us. We can begin to have affections towards them, feelings about them, not just perceptions. They become part of our world, and almost as it were the society within which we live. And this happens when we are children. Children are very often in these intense relationships with things. And that's why oftentimes they get upset when you throw them out or change them around. But this happens with adults as well. And that's not to say that all of this is good. The hoarder has their pathological connection with things. They can't let them go. I remember when I was a kid worrying, and this is so silly, but typical of what Rilke would talk about. We had stuffed animals, and I would play with some of them more because they were my favorites, and I would feel kind of bad that I didn't play with the other ones. Why? Because they were Rilkean things. They had a kind of presence. They had a vulnerability. Now, Rilke talks about things in terms of nature, like I said. He also talks about them in terms of what we might call the vast categories. Love is a thing as well as a problem and a question. Something that we encounter on our way. Death is a thing in this sense. God is a thing. A very strange kind of thing. And Rilke's God is a very, very strange kind of God, as we'll see in just a moment. And then there can be things that have sort of lost their essence, their ability to be things. He talks about this in terms of when he's in Rome, and why Rome is not such a great experience for him in terms of the way that it is for other people. And I think that we could relate to this in many ways. He says, here's what he didn't like about Rome. He says, Rome makes one feel stifled with sadness for the first few days, through the gloomy and lifeless museum atmosphere that it exhales, through the abundance of its pasts which are brought forth and laboriously held up, pasts on which a tiny present subsists, through the terrible overvaluing sustained by scholars and philologists and imitated by the ordinary tourist in Italy, of all these disfigured and decaying things, which after all are essentially nothing more than accidental remains from another time and from a life that is not and should not be ours. Rilke is willing to recognize those people lived and had their things and their solitudes and all of that just as much as vitally as we do, but their things are not our things. And it's silly for us to elevate them and, oh, wow, look at that Grecian vase, unless we can actually find ways to relate ourselves to those. Instead, what does he find that he enjoys in Rome? He says, one can slowly, there's beauty. There's not more beauty here than in other places. Where is it? Waters infinitely full of life move along the ancient aqueducts into the great city and dance in the many city squares over white basins of stone, spread out into large spacious pools and murmur day by day and lift their murmuring up to the night, which is vast here and starry and soft with winds. That's one example. He also says, in Rome, as well as in other places, one can slowly learn to recognize the very few things in which something eternal endures, that one can love, and something solitary that one can gently take part in. Pardon me. So things. This is something important to keep in mind as a category. Let's move now to God and talk about Rilke's conception of God, which is, in certain respects, quite unusual. His God is one who is hidden, who we do have to access in part through our engagement with nature. It's not as if he thinks that religion is just entirely, left behind. He does, at some point say some disparaging things about religion. But remember, the religiosity of his own time was very often a sort of social thing rather than something that people could really fit into. And he did spend quite a few of his poems trying to search out, almost like a Christian mystic, paths towards God. Let's see what he actually has to say about God. Letter 6 is very important for this. He's again, this is at Christmas time. He's writing to his interlocutor, and his interlocutor said, this is just after he said, you can access this world, this solitary world of things. Let me read these passages. He says, the situation you must live in now is not more heavily burdened with conventions, prejudices, and false ideas than all the other situations. If there are some that pretend to a greater freedom, there is nevertheless none that is in itself vast and spacious and connected to the important things that the truest kind of life consists in. Only the individual is solitary, is placed under the deepest laws like a thing. So he's said all that, and then he's recommended the world of things and animals and children. You remember that discussion. Then he says, and if it frightens and torments you to think of childhood and of the simplicity and silence that accompanies it, because you can no longer believe in God, who appears in it everywhere. So he's talking to a man who was brought up as a child believing in God and, understanding God to be everywhere. This is sort of a catechist notion of God. And children have ways of relating themselves to God that are often, viewed as very naive, that a lot of anti-religious people say is actually bad for them. Let's actually put all that aside, because that would be totally foreign to Rilke. Rilke thinks that it's a good thing, but it's not sufficient. It's not giving you God per se. He says, isn't it truer to say that you've never possessed God? For when could it have been? Do you think that a child can hold him whom grown men bear only with great effort and whose weight crushes the old? Rilke's God is not something that you can have this simple come to Jesus moment and then everything's totally clear. Rilke's God is a problem. If God is like love or death, God is a question. God is not something that provides the immediate answer to everything. It could be that God provides all the answers in the end, but only in the end. Not, shot like a cannon to the final stage. So he says, do you suppose that someone who really has him could lose him like a little stone? Or don't you think that someone who once had him could only be lost by him? Maybe you didn't lose God. God lost you. And he says, what justifies you if he never existed in missing him like someone who has passed away and in searching for him as though he were lost? And again, somebody might say, it's figments of the imagination. Rilke thinks that this nostalgia for God is really revelatory of something. Not necessarily the God that a lot of religious people make God out to be, but of something divine, something transcendent. And he says, here's where he offers his own view. Why don't you think of him as one who is coming, who has been approaching from all eternity, the one who will someday arrive, the ultimate fruit of a tree whose leaves we are? What keeps you from projecting his birth into the ages that are coming into existence and living your life as a painful and lovely day in the history of a great pregnancy? Don't you see how everything that happens is again and again a beginning? And couldn't it be his beginning? Since in itself, starting is always so beautiful, if he is the most perfect one, must not what is less perfect precede him so he can choose himself out of fullness and superabundance? Must he not be the last one so that he can include everything in himself? And what meaning would we have if he who we are longing for has already existed? Here's a beautiful metaphor that he has. As bees gather honey, so we collect what is sweetest of all things and build him, even with the trivial, with the insignificant, as long as it is done out of love. We begin with work and with the repose that comes afterward, with a silence or with a small solitary joy, with everything that we do alone, without anyone to join or help us. We start him who we will not live to see, just as our ancestors could not live to see us. Is there anything that can deprive you, he's saying this to his interlocutor, of the hope that in this way you will someday exist in him who is the farthest, the outermost limit? So what can we say about God? God is coming into being. God is developing. God is being progressively unveiled, choosing himself. This is, in many respects, similar to some of the conceptions that process philosophers have of God, but it strikes me as something much more intimate than what I see in the people who are associated with process philosophy, maybe because Rilke is a poet. God is not the same thing as our conceptions of God, is what Rilke would say. A little bit later, he says a few other things about God. He says that pardon me for a moment. He's talking about the future again, and these distances and things and human relationships. he says, and I guess this actually, I wrote this down here, but it doesn't actually have that much to do with God, but it does have to do with the future that he's sort of describing. He says, something is happening to you. Life has not forgotten you. It holds you in its hand and will not let you fall. Some people have wanted to see in Rilke sort of a pantheistic identification of God with nature and with life, but God is sort of the coalescing of all that is greatest and best and deepest in these things, and something in which we're permitted to participate. And you could ask, is God personal for Rilke? God is, in a certain respect, it's not that God is non-personal. God is sort of beyond personality for Rilke. Rilke is, in many respects, kind of a mystic. Let's move on to talk about love and sex. So he brings up sexuality at a number of places in these letters, and he says that sex is indeed a tough thing. And, we often present it as if it's, there just to sell things and a lot of fun and all that, but really it does cause us an awful lot of anguish, doesn't it, in our lives. So he says, letter 4, sex is difficult, yes. But those tasks that have been entrusted to us are difficult. Almost everything serious is difficult, and everything is serious. If you just recognize this and manage out of yourself your own talent and nature, out of your own experience and childhood and strength, to achieve a wholly individual relation to sex, one that is not influenced by convention and custom, you will no longer have to be afraid of losing yourself and become unworthy of your dearest possession. So we want to have something that is free from convention, and custom. Something that is purely individual. And, when he's saying something like that, that makes it sound sort of like a very consumeristic notion of sex. Like, well, you're just going to be on your own, choosing the stuff that you like and, literally screw everybody else or screw nobody else or do whatever you want. Whatever turns you on, man. That's completely at antipodes from what Rilke is talking about. That, he thinks, is triviality sort of squared. He's talking about this other artist, Richard Demel, and he says, the artist experienced life so unbelievably close to the sexual, to its pain and its pleasure, that the two phenomena are really just different forms of one and the same longing and bliss. And if instead of heat, one could say sex in the great, pure sense of the word, free of any sin attached to it by the church, then his art would be great and infinitely important. He was saying this about another artist. But then he says something really revealing. So, free of convention, free of the shame that comes with it, free of all these sort of things that people read into it, an expression of what it is that we're able to do as sexual beings. Then he says, this is one of the most difficult tests for the Creator. He must remain always unconscious, aware of his own best virtues if he does not want to rob them of their candor and innocence. And then, when thundering through his being, it arrives at the sexual, it finds someone who is not so pure as it needs him to be. Instead of a completely ripe and pure world, so let's write that down, ripe and pure world of sexuality, it finds a world that is not human enough. A world that is only male, is heat, thunder, and restlessness, and is burdened with the old prejudice and arrogance with which the male is always disfigured and burdened love. Because he loves only as a male and not as a human being, there is something narrow in his sexual feeling. Something that seems wild, malicious, time-bound, uneternal, which diminishes his art and makes it ambiguous and doubtful. That's a very interesting thing to say, isn't it? So, we want to be not only free from convention and custom, we want to be very careful about this question of the male versus the female. How we understand maleness, how we understand femaleness. Are they just merely opposites to each other? Rilke actually wants to suggest something beyond that, which I think is actually quite interesting. Let's go on and look at some of the other things that he has to say about this. So he is talking about this in letter 7. He takes these themes up again. And we're going to focus very heavily on letter 7, because that's the one where these things come to a crux. So he says, "It is good to love because love is difficult. For one human being to love another human being, that is perhaps the most difficult task that has been entrusted to us, the ultimate task, the final test and proof, the work for which all other work is merely preparation." I want to pause on that for a moment. So we've talked about solitariness. We've talked about development of the self and these vast distances that are involved. But here, Rilke is saying to this guy who is a poet, who he's been saying all these other things to love is the ultimate task, the final test and proof, the work for which all other work is merely preparation. Everything else leads to this. This is why young people who are beginners in everything are not yet capable of love. It's a paradoxical thing to say, because young people are always falling in love, aren't they? Isn't that the time to fall in love, when you're young and dumb, and you know how the rest of the expression goes? He says it's something they must learn. With their whole being, their forces gathered around their solitary, anxious, upward beating heart, they must learn to love. But learning time is always a long, secluded time, and therefore loving for a long time ahead and far on to life is solitude, a heightened and deepened kind of aloneness for the person who loves. Without the retreat into oneself and the dignity of having a world that one is related to, that is not everybody else's world, one cannot fully love. Rilke would say the sort of attitudes towards sexuality that many people have in our culture, that it's some people think it's just something shameful. He would say, well, that's wrong, but the people who want to see it as just pure enjoyment and do whatever you like, and he would say that's damaging to you. You don't just try everything just to try it out. You have to actually be developed before you can love. He says, loving does not first mean merging, surrendering, and uniting with another person. For what would a union be of two people who are unclarified, unfinished, and still incoherent? Love requires solitude. Love requires development. Only if one has actually blossomed forth into a fully authentic person is one capable of loving. And you could easily find yourself in the middle of a relationship and say to yourself, holy crap, I'm not really fully capable of love. I got to find some way to not get out of this relationship, but learn how to actually be the kind of person who could love another person. He says it's a high inducement for the individual to ripen, to become something in himself, to become world for the sake of another person. Merging and surrendering in every kind of communion is not for them, for the young. He says, this is where young people go so tragically wrong. They fling themselves at each other when love takes hold of them. They scatter themselves just as they are in their messiness, disorder, bewilderment. And what can happen then? He's not saying, oh, you're no good or anything like that. He's just saying, look, you're not fully developed. What's going to happen when you fall in love and you get together with somebody else who's just as messed up and unfinished as you are? Says, what can life do with this heap of half-broken things that they call their communion and that they would like to call their happiness, if that were possible, in their future? Each of them loses himself for the sake of the other person and loses the other and many others who wanted to come, and loses the vast distances and possibilities, gives up the approaching and fleeing of gentle prescient things in exchange for an unfruitful communion, out of which nothing more can come, nothing but a bit of disgust, disappointment, and poverty, and the escape into the many conventions that have been put up in great numbers like public shelters on this most dangerous road. He says, no area of human experience has so many of these conventional shelters. And then he goes on, and he says, if you're going to fall into one of these shelters, one of these conventions, you're not doing yourself any favor by jumping out of it right into another one. He says, many people who love falsely simply surrendering themselves and giving up their solitude, which, by the way, Rilke thinks the average person will always do. He says they feel oppressed by their failure and they want to make the situation they've landed in livable and fruitful in their own personal way. There is another key danger. You can only have a livable, fruitful situation by being willing to accept what nature, what the world, what life is willing to give you, not by trying to impose your own, demands upon it. So he says they act out of mutual helplessness, and then with the best of intentions they try to escape the convention that's approaching them, for example, marriage. They fall into the clutches of some less obvious but just as deadly conventional situation or solution. Everything around them is convention. Whenever people act out of a prematurely fused muddy communion, every action is conventional. Unless you've developed, Rilke thinks, through solitude, the kind of self that you need, that's integrated. When you join up with another person, the best that you can hope for is something conventional, which is not going to be really fulfilling. It's not going to be truly satisfying, and one won't be able to truly love within that. Then he goes on and he talks a bit more about love, and he says, we are now only just beginning to consider the relationship of one individual to a second individual objectively and without prejudice. Our attempts to live such relationships have no model before them. And then he says, the girl and the woman in their new individual unfolding will only in passing be imitators of male behavior and misbehavior and repeaters of male professions. So if, he's dealing with the question of things have been dominated by the male point of view, which is an insufficient and not, rich, pure point of view. Women, when they first become liberated, take on their own facsimile of that, but are supposed to move beyond that. And he says, women in whom life lingers and dwells more immediately, more fruitfully, and more confidently must surely have become riper and more human in their depths than light, easygoing man. And he talks about the humanity of women carried in her womb through all her suffering and humiliation, will come to light when she has stripped off the conventions of mere femaleness in the transformations of her outward status. I think that a lot of forms of contemporary feminism, Rilke would say, are still, even though they're pretending to go against convention, are hyper-conventional in their own way. And here's what he looks ahead to. He says, someday there will be girls and women whose name will no longer mean the mere opposite of the male, but something in itself, something that makes one think not of any complement and limit, but only of life and reality, the female human being. This advance, he says, will transform the love experience, which is now filled with error. We'll change it from the ground up and reshape it into a relationship that is meant to be between one human being and another, no longer one that flows from man to woman. He's not saying that we won't still have all these heterosexual relationships, and probably as the norm, but he looks ahead to a time when this will be transformed through people working through their solitude, not through some political solution, not through some economic solution, not through technology, but through human development. He says there's more human love will resemble what we are now preparing painfully with great struggle. The love that consists in this, that two solitudes protect and border and greet each other. And he has other remarks to say about sexuality, some very interesting things in there. But I think this is a very good place to end. We began with discussion of solitude. We end with a reference to solitude. And I want to repeat this one more time. This is what he thinks that we're working towards if we're carrying out his sort of ascesis, his sort of developmental path. The love that consists in this, that two solitudes protect and border and greet each other.